The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Judge David Coleman finished reviewing his final case files of the week. After 15 years on the bench, he still felt the same sense of responsibility that had driven him through law school and his early days as a prosecutor. Today was special, though. His nephew Tony was graduating from high school, and David had promised to be there. At 52, David had built a reputation as one of the fairest judges in the state. Lawyers respected him, and even defendants who received tough sentences often left his courtroom feeling they had been heard. He treated everyone with dignity, whether they were wearing expensive suits or orange jumpsuits. That's just who he was. David packed up his briefcase and changed out of his judge's robes. He pulled on a comfortable pair of jeans and a navy blue polo shirt. The graduation ceremony was in a different part of town about 30 minutes away. He wanted to blend in with the other proud family members, not stick out as the judge. His secretary, Helen, knocked on his door. "Have a wonderful time at the graduation, Your Honor. Tony must be so excited." "He is. Kid worked hard for this moment." David smiled. "I'll see you Monday morning." The drive to Riverside High School was pleasant. David loved these quiet moments between the intensity of court proceedings. He thought about Tony, who had struggled in his early teens but found his way through determination and family support. The boy reminded David of himself at that age, ambitious but sometimes unsure of the path forward. The graduation ceremony was everything David hoped it would be. Tony walked across the stage with confidence, his smile bright as he received his diploma. David's sister Patricia wiped away tears of joy. The whole family cheered as Tony waved from the stage. These were the moments that mattered most. After the ceremony, the family gathered for photos and congratulations. Tony was heading to community college in the fall, planning to study business. "I want to start my own company someday, Uncle David," he said excitedly. "You can do anything you set your mind to," David replied. Genuinely proud of his nephew's growth, the celebration continued at a nearby restaurant, but David had to leave early. He had promised to review some important documents over the weekend for a complex case starting Monday. The family understood. They knew how seriously he took his responsibilities. As David drove through the upscale Oakwood neighborhood on his way home, he noticed how different it felt from the courthouse downtown. The streets were lined with mature oak trees, and the houses sat back on large, well-maintained lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood where people jogged in the evenings and walked their dogs without a second thought about safety. He spotted a small coffee shop called Bean There that he'd never noticed before. The sign in the window said they closed at 6 and it was already 5:30. David decided to stop for a quick coffee. He had a long evening of work ahead, and the caffeine would help him focus. David parked his black sedan, a practical car he'd owned for 3 years, and walked toward the coffee shop. A few other customers were inside, and the barista was cleaning equipment, clearly preparing to close soon. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, and David felt himself relaxing for the first time all day. Meanwhile, Officer Rick Thompson was nearing the end of his shift. At 38, he'd been with the police force for 12 years, though his record was far from stellar. Thompson had received multiple complaints over the years, citizens claiming he was too aggressive, that he treated people unfairly. The department had investigated some of these complaints, but Thompson always managed to explain his way out of serious consequences. Thompson drove through the Oakwood area regularly. He knew the residents, knew their routines, knew their cars. When he saw David's sedan pull up to the coffee shop, something triggered his suspicion. The car was nice but not flashy, and the driver was a black man he didn't recognize. In Thompson's mind, this combination spelled trouble. The officer had developed what he called instincts over his years on the force, though others might call them prejudices. He'd grown up in a different part of town, where he'd learned to view certain neighborhoods as his territory to protect. The fact that he didn't recognize this particular person made him immediately suspicious. Thompson parked his patrol car across the street and watched. David emerged from the coffee shop a few minutes later, carrying a large coffee and checking his phone. He looked relaxed, unhurried, just a man ending a good day with his family. But Thompson saw something different. He saw someone who didn't belong in this neighborhood, someone who might be casing the area or up to no good. These thoughts weren't based on anything David was actually doing. They were based on assumptions Thompson had been making for years. David got back in his car and started the engine. He pulled out his phone to check the GPS for the quickest route home. Traffic could be unpredictable on Saturday evenings, and he wanted to get back to his work. He had no idea that his simple stop for coffee had attracted unwanted attention. Thompson made a decision that would change both their lives. He started his patrol car and pulled out behind David's sedan. In his mind, he was just doing his job, keeping the neighborhood safe. But what he was really doing was profiling an innocent man based on nothing more than the color of his skin and unfounded suspicions. David noticed the police car in his rearview mirror, but thought nothing of it. As a judge, he knew police officers were always on patrol, especially in nicer neighborhoods. He had no reason to worry. His record was clean, his car was legal, and he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just a man driving home after celebrating his nephew's graduation. The two men, one a respected judge, the other a troubled officer, were about to collide in a moment that would expose the worst and best of human nature. David continued driving, thinking about the case files waiting at home. Thompson followed, his suspicions growing with each block, preparing to make a stop that would shock everyone involved. Neither man knew that in just a few minutes, their quiet Saturday evening would explode into a confrontation that would test everything they believed about justice, respect, and the power of truth. The stage was set for an encounter that would change not just their lives, but the entire community around them. David drove slowly through the tree-lined streets, enjoying the peaceful evening. His coffee sat in the cup holder, still warm, and he hummed quietly along with the jazz station on his radio. The graduation ceremony had filled him with hope. Seeing young people like Tony work hard and achieve their dreams always reminded him why he chose public service. Behind him, Officer Thompson's mind was racing with assumptions. He'd been following the black sedan for 6 blocks now, and his suspicions were growing stronger with each turn. The driver was moving slowly, seemingly looking around, exactly what Thompson expected from someone casing the neighborhood. The truth was that David was simply being cautious in an unfamiliar area, but Thompson saw what he wanted to see. Thompson flipped on his emergency lights. The red and blue flashing immediately filled David's car, reflecting off his mirrors. David's first thought was concern. Maybe someone ahead was in trouble or there was an accident. He began looking for a safe place to pull over so the officer could pass, but Thompson wasn't trying to get around him. The patrol car stayed directly behind David's sedan, clearly indicating this was a traffic stop. David felt a familiar knot in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had countless times over the years when dealing with law enforcement. Even as a respected judge, these encounters always carried an edge of uncertainty. David pulled over safely near a small park. He turned off his engine, placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and waited. These were habits developed over years of being a black man in America, habits that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with survival. Thompson approached the driver's side window with an aggressive stance. His hand rested on his service weapon, and his face showed obvious irritation. Before David could even roll down his window completely, Thompson was already speaking. License and registration, now. Thompson's tone was sharp and demanding, with none of the professional courtesy that should mark police interactions. David kept his movements slow and deliberate. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why you stopped me?" The question seemed to anger Thompson immediately. "I'll ask the questions here. License and registration." David reached slowly for his wallet, making sure his movements were visible. "Of course. I'm just reaching for my wallet." He pulled out his driver's license and registration, handing them through the window. Thompson grabbed the documents without a thank you. He studied David's license with suspicion, as if looking for something wrong. The address showed David lived across town, which only confirmed Thompson's belief that this man didn't belong in Oakwood. "David Coleman," Thompson read aloud, his tone suggesting the name itself was suspicious. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" David maintained his calm demeanor, though inside he felt the familiar frustration. "I stopped for coffee at Bean there, and now I'm heading home." "Coffee," Thompson repeated as if this was an obvious lie. "In Oakwood, where you don't live." He leaned closer to the window, trying to intimidate David with his presence. "Yes, sir. I was in the area for a family Vent. David's voice remained respectful but firm. He'd learned long ago that showing fear only made these situations worse, but showing too much confidence could be just as dangerous. Thompson walked back to his patrol car to run David's license. The computer quickly showed David's clean record. No tickets, no arrests, no warrants. But instead of being satisfied, this information only frustrated Thompson more. He'd been certain he'd found trouble, and being wrong made him angrier. When Thompson returned to David's car, his attitude had somehow gotten worse. "Step out of the vehicle." David felt his heart rate increase. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. My license is valid, my registration is current, and I wasn't speeding. I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Thompson's voice had risen, drawing attention from people walking in the nearby park. David had two choices: comply with an unreasonable request or escalate the situation by refusing. His 15 years as a judge had taught him about police procedures, and he knew this stop had already gone far beyond anything justified by the circumstances. But he also knew that arguing with an aggressive officer could turn dangerous quickly. "I'm going to step out slowly," David said, opening his door carefully. He emerged from his car with his hands visible, moving deliberately to avoid any sudden motions that could be misinterpreted. Thompson immediately moved closer, invading David's personal space. "Turn around. Hands on the car." "Officer, I really think there's been some misunderstanding," David said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "I'm a judge here in the city. I was just getting coffee after my nephew's graduation." The word judge seemed to enrage Thompson even more. "Right, and I'm the governor. Hands on the car. Now." David complied, placing his hands on the roof of his sedan. He could feel people watching from the park, could sense their phones coming out to record. Part of him was embarrassed, but another part was grateful for the witnesses. Thompson began searching David roughly, far more aggressively than necessary. "Empty your pockets." David's wallet, phone, keys, and courthouse ID badge landed on the hood of his car. Thompson barely glanced at the ID badge. In his anger and prejudice, he wasn't really looking at evidence anymore. He was looking for ways to justify his suspicions. "Where are the drugs?" Thompson demanded. "There are no drugs, officer." "I don't use drugs." David's voice carried a slight tremor now, not from fear, but from the deep frustration of being treated like a criminal for no reason. "Everyone says that." Thompson continued his aggressive search, checking David's car without permission. "What about weapons? Guns? No weapons." "Officer, I really need you to look at my ID. I am Judge David Coleman. I work downtown at the courthouse. You can call and verify." But Thompson wasn't listening anymore. His mind had already decided David was lying, was probably dangerous, was definitely where he didn't belong. When David continued trying to explain his identity, Thompson interpreted this as talking back and being difficult. "Stop resisting," Thompson shouted. Though David hadn't resisted anything, the situation was spinning out of control. David could see more people gathering in the park, could hear someone calling for others to come witness what was happening. He knew this encounter was being recorded by multiple people, which gave him some comfort but also highlighted how wrong everything was going. Thompson's radio crackled with routine chatter from dispatch, but he ignored it. He was too focused on his confrontation with David, too invested in proving he'd been right to make this stop. The fact that he'd found absolutely no evidence of wrongdoing only made him more aggressive, more determined to find something to justify his actions. David remained as calm as possible, knowing that any reaction could be used against him, but inside he was thinking about all the times he'd heard stories like this from defendants in his courtroom. He'd always listened with compassion, but experiencing it himself gave him a deeper understanding of how quickly these encounters could become dangerous. The crowd in the park was growing larger. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone!" But Thompson was too focused on David to pay attention to the witnesses. The officer's training should have told him to de-escalate, to step back and assess the situation objectively. Instead, his prejudices were driving him toward a confrontation that would soon shock everyone watching, including himself. The tension in the air was thick as more people gathered. In the park across from where Officer Thompson had David, pressed against his car, cell phone cameras were recording from multiple angles, capturing every word and movement. The crowd had grown from a few curious joggers to nearly 20 people, all watching in disbelief as the situation continued to escalate. David remained pressed against his car, his hands flat on the roof, trying to stay calm despite the humiliation and frustration building inside him. He could hear whispers from the crowd, could feel their eyes on him. This was exactly the kind of encounter he'd spent his career trying to prevent, through fair and thoughtful judicial decisions. Thompson seemed oblivious to the growing audience. His focus was entirely on David, convinced he was dealing with someone dangerous despite finding absolutely no evidence to support that belief. The officer's breathing was heavy, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline. "I'm telling you one more time," David said, his voice steady but strained. "I am Judge David Coleman. My courthouse ID is right there on the hood of my car. Please just look at it. Stop lying," Thompson shouted back loud enough that his voice carried clearly to the crowd. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know a fake when I see one?" But Thompson hadn't actually looked at the ID carefully. In his agitated state, he'd dismissed it without examination, too focused on his preconceived notions to consider that David might be telling the truth. Among the crowd watching, a woman named Lisa Chen stepped closer. She was a local attorney who had appeared in David's courtroom many times over the past 5 years. She recognized his voice first, then his profile. Her eyes widened in shock as she realized what was happening. "Oh my God," she whispered to the person next to her. "That's Judge Coleman." Her voice wasn't loud, but in the tense silence between Thompson's demands and David's responses, several people heard her clearly. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd as people looked more closely at the man being detained. "Judge Coleman?" someone repeated louder this time. Thompson spun around, his face twisted with irritation. "Everyone back away! This is police business." But Lisa Chen was not intimidated. She'd spent years in courtrooms and she knew injustice when she saw it. "Officer, that man is telling you the truth. That is Judge David Coleman from the downtown courthouse. I'm an attorney and I've appeared before him many times." Thompson's face showed confusion for a moment, then anger. "Lady, you need to step back. This man is lying and I don't need civilians telling me how to do my job." "I'm not a civilian," Lisa replied firmly, pulling out her state bar card. "I'm attorney Lisa Chen and I'm telling you that you have made a serious mistake. That man is a sitting judge." Other voices joined in from the crowd. "She's right. I've seen his picture in the newspaper. That's Judge Coleman. He sentenced my neighbor's son last year." "Officer, you need to listen to these people." David felt a mix of relief and continued anxiety. While it was good that people were recognizing him, he also knew that an angry, cornered police officer could become even more dangerous. He'd seen too many cases where situations like this escalated into tragedy. Thompson looked around at the crowd, then back at David, then at the courthouse ID lying on the car hood. For the first time since the stop began, doubt crept into his mind. But admitting he was wrong would be humiliating, especially with so many people watching and recording. "Anyone can fake an ID," Thompson said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried minutes before. That's when Thompson's radio crackled to life with a call that would change everything. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. We have a report of a possible situation involving a judge in the Oakwood area. Can you respond?" The color drained from Thompson's face. Someone in the crowd had called the police department. The call had reached dispatch and now other officers were being sent to investigate. Thompson realized that his supervisor would soon know exactly what he had been doing. David heard the radio call too. "Officer, that call is about me. People saw what was happening and called it in. This can still be resolved peacefully if you'll just verify my identity." Thompson's hands shook slightly as he picked up David's courthouse ID and looked at it carefully for the first time. The official seal was clearly visible, along with David's photograph and title. "The Honorable Judge David Coleman, Superior Court." There was no question about its authenticity. The realization hit Thompson like a physical blow. He had just spent 20 minutes humiliating, searching, and detaining one of the most respected judges in the state. His career flashed before his eyes. The complaints in his file, the warnings from supervisors, the thin ice he'd been skating on for years. This wasn't just another incident he could explain away. This was career-ending. "Jesus," Thompson whispered, stepping back from David. His face had gone pale, and sweat was forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. David straightened up slowly, his hands coming down from the car roof. Officer, I think we need to have a calm conversation about what happens next. But Thompson wasn't capable of calm conversation. The magnitude of his mistake was sinking in and panic was taking over. The crowd was still watching, still recording. The radio calls were continuing, with dispatch coordinating the response of multiple units to the scene. Lisa Chen stepped forward again. Judge Coleman, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? David shook his head. I'm okay, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate you speaking up. Thompson looked around wildly as if looking for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. Police sirens were audible in the distance, getting closer. His fellow officers were coming, and they would see exactly what he had done. His supervisors would know. The media would probably find out. His life as he knew it was over. I was just... Thompson started to speak, but no coherent words came out. How could he explain that he'd targeted an innocent man based on nothing but racial prejudice? How could he justify the aggressive treatment, the refusal to look at identification, the escalation of a simple traffic stop into a public humiliation? David looked at the officer with something that might have been pity. He'd seen this moment before, the moment when someone realized their actions had consequences they couldn't escape. It happened in his courtroom regularly, when defendants finally understood the full weight of what they'd done. Officer Thompson, David said quietly, reading the name tag for the first time. I think you should call your supervisor. This situation needs to be handled properly. The first patrol car appeared around the corner, followed quickly by two more. The cavalry was arriving, but instead of backing up Thompson's actions, they were coming to investigate them. Thompson's fellow officers were about to become witnesses to his disgrace. As the patrol cars pulled up with lights flashing, Thompson made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Look, maybe we can work this out. Maybe we don't need to make a big deal about this. But it was far too late for that. The crowd had recorded everything. Dispatch had logged the calls. Multiple officers were now on scene. The wheels of accountability were already in motion, and nothing Thompson could say or do would stop them. David straightened his shirt and prepared to explain to the arriving officers what had happened. He knew this was just the beginning of what would be a long and difficult process, but he also knew that the truth was now out in the open. The shocking discovery of his identity had changed everything, and there would be no going back. The first patrol car to arrive belonged to Sergeant Angela Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with an impeccable record and a reputation for handling difficult situations with wisdom and professionalism. As she stepped out of her vehicle, she immediately sensed the tension in the air. The crowd was larger than usual for a routine traffic stop, and everyone seemed to be recording with their phones. Rodriguez walked toward Thompson, but her attention was drawn to the man standing beside the black sedan. Something about him looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen him before. Then it hit her. She recognized him from the courthouse where she'd testified in cases over the years. Thompson, what's the situation here? Rodriguez asked, though her eyes remained on David. Thompson's voice cracked as he tried to respond. There was a suspicious person and I made a stop and... He couldn't finish the sentence. The word sounded ridiculous even to him now. David stepped forward calmly. Sergeant Rodriguez, isn't it? I believe you testified in my courtroom about 6 months ago in the Henderson robbery case. Rodriguez's eyes widened with recognition and shock. Judge Coleman? Oh my. Thompson, do you realize who this is? The second and third patrol cars had arrived, bringing officers Martinez and Johnson. Both officers immediately noticed the unusual scene. A crowd of civilians, multiple people recording, and their colleague Thompson looking like he was about to be sick. Someone want to tell me what's going on here? Officer Martinez called out as he approached. Lisa Chen, the attorney who had first recognized David, stepped forward with her bar card visible. Officers, I'm attorney Lisa Chen. What's going on here? Is that Officer Thompson just spent the last 25 minutes illegally, detaining Judge David Coleman based on nothing more than racial profiling. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Martinez and Johnson looked at Thompson, then at David, then back at Thompson. They'd both heard stories about Thompson's aggressive tactics, and now they were witnessing the inevitable result. Sergeant Rodriguez took charge of the situation. Judge Coleman, are you injured? Do you require medical attention? I'm fine, Sergeant. Shaken up but not hurt, David replied. Though I do want to make sure all of this is properly documented. Rodriguez nodded gravely. Absolutely, Your Honor. Thompson, I need you to step over here with me. Now. As Rodriguez pulled Thompson aside for a private conversation, more vehicles began arriving. The police captain's car appeared, followed by an unmarked sedan carrying internal affairs investigators. Word had traveled fast through the department, and everyone knew this was going to be a major incident. Captain Frank Williams emerged from his vehicle with the grim expression of a man who knew his department was about to face a public relations nightmare. He'd been hoping to end his 30-year career without any major scandals, but that hope was evaporating before his eyes. Judge Coleman, Captain Williams said, extending his hand respectfully, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am about this incident. I want you to know that this will be investigated thoroughly. David shook the captain's hand. Captain Williams, I appreciate your response, but I want to be clear. This isn't just about me. This is about how your officers treat all citizens. I have the privilege of recognition and status that protected me tonight. But what about people who don't? The captain nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right, Your Honor, and I promise you this will be addressed comprehensively. Meanwhile, Thompson was falling apart under questioning from Sergeant Rodriguez. He looked suspicious. I was just doing my job. Your job? Rodriguez's voice was sharp. Your job is to protect and serve all citizens, not harass innocent people. Do you realize what you've done? Do you understand the position you've put this entire department in? Thompson looked around desperately, seeing his career crumbling in real time. The crowd was still watching, still recording. News vans were beginning to arrive as word of the incident spread on social media. Someone had live-streamed parts of the confrontation, and it was already going viral. The internal affairs investigators began interviewing witnesses immediately. Lisa Chen gave a detailed account of what she'd observed. Other members of the crowd corroborated her story, describing Thompson's aggressive behavior and refusal to examine David's identification. The officer seemed angry from the moment he approached, one witness explained. Like he'd already decided this man was guilty of something, even though he was just standing there peacefully. David found himself surrounded by people offering support. Several other attorneys had arrived after hearing about the incident through the legal community's informal network. The president of the local bar association was on her way. This was becoming much larger than a simple case of police misconduct. Thompson's body camera footage was immediately secured as evidence. The recordings clearly showed his aggressive approach, his refusal to properly examine David's identification, and his escalating behavior throughout the encounter. There would be no disputing what had happened. As the scene continued to unfold, Thompson was officially suspended from duty pending investigation. Captain Williams made the announcement publicly, in front of the crowd and the news cameras that had arrived. Officer Thompson has been suspended immediately, the captain announced. This incident does not represent the values or standards of our police department. We will cooperate fully with all investigations and ensure that justice is served. David was offered a ride home, but he declined. I want to drive myself. I won't let this incident change how I live my life. But he did accept police escort to ensure his safety, knowing that the attention might bring unwanted consequences. As David prepared to leave, he addressed the crowd that had supported him. Thank you all for speaking up tonight. Your voices made the difference between this being covered up and this being exposed. That's how change happens, when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. The crowd applauded, but David wasn't finished. However, I want everyone to remember that this could have ended very differently. If those cameras hadn't been recording, if Attorney Chen hadn't recognized me, if you hadn't called it in, who knows what might have happened. That's the reality too many people face every day. Thompson sat in the back of a patrol car, no longer an officer but a suspect himself. The internal affairs investigators had read him his rights and informed him that he would likely face both criminal charges and civil litigation. His union representative was on the way, but everyone knew there was little that could be done to save his career. The incident was already making national news. Social media was exploding with outrage and support for David. The hashtag #JudgeColeman was trending, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences with police misconduct. District Attorney Patricia Johnson arrived on scene as David was preparing to leave. She and David had worked together for over a decade, and her face showed both professional concern and personal anger about what had happened to her colleague. "David, I want you to know that my office will pursue this case aggressively," she said. "Criminal charges will definitely be filed." David nodded. "I appreciate that, Patricia, but I also want to use this as an opportunity to push for systemic changes. This can't just be about punishing one bad officer." As David finally drove away from the scene, escorted by 2 patrol cars, he reflected on how quickly his quiet Saturday evening had turned into a national incident. He thought about Tony's graduation earlier that day, about the hope and promise that ceremony had represented. Now he was dealing with the uglier realities that still existed in their society. But David also felt something unexpected, a sense of opportunity. This terrible experience could become a catalyst for the kind of changes he'd been advocating for throughout his career. Sometimes it took a shocking incident to force people to confront uncomfortable truths about justice and equality. The story was far from over. This was just the beginning of a process that would ultimately reach the highest levels of government and change how police departments across the country handled accountability and training. But as David drove home through the darkening streets, he knew that truth and justice had prevailed, at least for tonight. 3 weeks had passed since the incident that shocked the nation. Judge David Coleman sat in his chambers, reviewing a stack of letters from people across the country who had shared their own experiences with police misconduct. The response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of attorneys, activists, and ordinary citizens reaching out to thank him for his courage and to share their stories. The immediate aftermath had been intense. The video footage from that Saturday evening had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms. News organizations from around the world had covered the story. David had appeared on several national television programs, always with the same message. This wasn't just about him, but about the countless others who faced similar treatment without the protection his position provided. Former Officer Rick Thompson's fall had been swift and complete. Criminal charges for assault, civil rights violations, and official misconduct had been filed within days. His police union had initially tried to defend him, but the video evidence was too clear, too damning. Thompson had been terminated from the force and was facing the possibility of years in prison. The civil lawsuit had been settled quickly, with the city agreeing to a substantial financial payment, and more importantly, to David's demands for comprehensive police reform. David had insisted that any settlement include mandatory changes to training, accountability measures, and community oversight. David's phone buzzed with a text from his nephew Tony. "Uncle David, saw you on the news again. So proud of how you're handling everything. Can't wait to start college next month." The message brought a smile to David's face. Through all the attention and controversy, Tony had remained focused on his future, inspired rather than discouraged by his uncle's experience. That resilience gave David hope for the next generation. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His secretary Helen entered with District Attorney Patricia Johnson, who had become one of David's strongest allies in pushing for systemic changes. "David, I wanted to update you on the Thompson case," Patricia said, taking a seat across from his desk. "His attorney is pushing for a plea deal, but we're not interested in anything less than significant jail time. The community needs to see that this kind of behavior has real consequences." David nodded. "I agree, but I also want to make sure we're focusing on the bigger picture. Sending Thompson to prison is important, but it won't change the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." Patricia smiled. "That's why I have good news. The City Council voted unanimously last night to implement all the reforms you proposed. Body cameras will be mandatory for all officers, with footage automatically uploaded to an independent server. Civilian Oversight Board will have real power to investigate complaints, and every officer will undergo comprehensive bias training." The changes went beyond what David had initially hoped for. The police department would be required to publish quarterly reports on traffic stops, including demographic data that would help identify patterns of racial profiling. Officers with multiple complaints would face automatic review, regardless of whether those complaints had been officially sustained. Captain Williams, who had handled the initial response professionally, had been promoted to lead the reform implementation. His first action had been to review every officer's complaint history and mandate additional training for anyone with patterns of problematic behavior. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "The governor wants to meet with you next week. She's interested in making these reforms statewide." David felt the weight of opportunity and responsibility. His personal nightmare was becoming a catalyst for changes that could protect countless other people from similar experiences. But he also knew that real change would require sustained effort, not just the temporary attention that controversial incidents often generated. That evening, David attended a community meeting in the Oakwood neighborhood where the incident had occurred. The same park where people had gathered to witness his detention was now the site of a community dialogue about police relations and racial justice. Lisa Chen, the attorney who had first recognized him during the incident, was helping to moderate the discussion. She had become an important voice in the reform movement, using her legal expertise to help design the new oversight mechanisms. Judge Coleman's experience opened a lot of eyes, Lisa told the diverse crowd of residents. But we need to remember that this happens to people in our community regularly. The only difference is that usually there aren't cameras rolling and a crowd of witnesses. David spoke to the gathering about the importance of community involvement and police accountability. "Change doesn't happen just because we pass new policies," he explained. "It happens because citizens stay engaged, because you continue to demand transparency, because you hold leaders accountable for following through on their promises." An elderly black woman in the front row raised her hand. "Judge Coleman, my grandson was stopped by police 3 times last month walking home from his job. Same officer each time. Nothing ever happened to him, thank God, but I worry every day. Will these changes really make a difference for kids like him?" David's response was honest. "I believe they will, but only if we all stay vigilant. These reforms create tools and mechanisms for accountability, but tools are only effective if people use them. Your grandson's experiences need to be documented, reported, and investigated. That's how we identify problem officers before they escalate to violence." The meeting continued for 2 hours, with residents sharing stories, asking questions, and discussing how to maintain momentum for change. David was struck by the diversity of the crowd, people of all races and backgrounds who had been brought together by a shared commitment to justice. After the meeting, David was approached by several young people, including a high school student named Kevin, who reminded him of Tony at that age. "Judge Coleman, I want to be a lawyer someday," Kevin said. "But after seeing what happened to you, I'm wondering if things will ever really change. How do you stay hopeful?" David put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "I stay hopeful because of people like you, Kevin. Because you're asking the right questions and because you want to be part of the solution. Change is slow and sometimes it's frustrating, but it does happen when good people refuse to accept injustice." 6 months later, David was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. The changes implemented in his city had become a model for departments across the country. The incident that had started as a personal nightmare had evolved into a movement that was touching communities nationwide. Thompson had ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges and received a 3-year prison sentence. More importantly, he had lost his certification as a police officer, ensuring he could never again hold a position of law enforcement authority. The civil settlement had funded community programs and police training initiatives. David's nephew, Tony, was thriving in college, studying business and planning to focus on social entrepreneurship. "I want to create businesses that make communities stronger," Tony had told David during a recent visit. "What happened to you showed me that everyone has a role to play in making things better." As David reflected on the journey from that Saturday evening in Oakwood to the national stage, he realized that the most important changes were often the ones that couldn't be measured in policy documents or budget allocations. The real victory was in the conversations happening in communities across the country, in the young people inspired to pursue careers in public service, in the officers who were embracing new approaches to their work. The incident had been traumatic, humiliating, and infuriating. But it had also revealed the power of truth, the importance of witnesses willing to speak up, and the possibility of turning personal pain into societal progress. David knew that the work was far from finished, But he also knew that change was not only possible but inevitable when people